Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Houston, and welcome to the general session of the State Bar Texas Annual Meeting. We sincerely hope that you guys have enjoyed the conference so far. As I'm sure you can imagine, a tremendous amount of work goes into putting on a meeting of this magnitude. I'd like to thank the Houston-based Annual Meeting Committee, the State Bar sections, and especially the annual meeting staff for all they've done to put on a wonderful program and celebration of the work that we do together to strengthen our profession. Finally, thank you to all the law firms and corporations who financially supported this meeting through their generous sponsorships. This general session is our opportunity to congratulate and recognize those lawyers who've practiced law for 50 years. It's also our opportunity to say thank you to Tom Vick for his service as president and to welcome our new president, Joe Longley. The program will continue through lunch, but before we enjoy our meal together, I'd like to invite Reverend Catherine McNeely from Austin to lead us in the invocation.
Will you please join me in prayer? God of us all, we pause for just a moment to recognize and give thanks for the abundance in our lives, for life itself, for health allowing us to be here today, for our minds and the ability to be involved in valuable and beneficial work, and for all the honor and responsibility that brings. For the leaders of the State Bar, we give thanks for the work of the past year and ask your continuing guidance in the coming year, that they may work together with clarity and compassion, responsibility and respect. And for all gathered in this room, we pray for your insight and wisdom as we work to treat all people with respect, to honor and dignify diversity, and to protect and assure equal rights and equal justice. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
And now the Region 2 DPS Honor Guard will come forward for the Color Guard presentation, followed by Ware Wendell, who will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Tom Vick. I'm currently your president of the State Bar, and I couldn't tell you how happy I am to be standing here in front of you. This time yesterday I was getting an IV and couldn't have stood here before you, so I'm pleased to be here. The first order of business for me is to make a presentation of the President's Award. It's given to the person or entity that all the past presidents of the State Bar believe has done the most for the bar during this past year. It is always a difficult decision. This year, the President's Award is awarded to Dale Felton. Dale Felton is a Navasota trial lawyer and insurance law expert with a long history of giving back to the legal profession. A past president of the Houston Trial Lawyers Association, Dale helped numerous homeowners recover damages caused by Hurricane Ike. When Hurricane Harvey devastated part of southeast Texas in 2017, Dale selflessly shared his vast knowledge of insurance law and flood insurance and those relevant issues with other attorneys online, becoming a go-to source for his colleagues. Frankly, I've read some of his posts. You should get CLE for reading what Dale puts on Facebook. The ABA Journal called Dale the breakout star of the Texas Lawyers Facebook group, and page creator Andrew Tolchin likened many of Dale's posts to CLE courses. Another attorney, Andrew Weisblatt, spoke for Dale's peers when he called Dale's post authoritative and so full of what people desperately needed. The State Bar of Texas past presidents commend Dale for his dedicated service to his colleagues and the people of our great state. Thank you, Dale. My next presentation is called the Certificate of Merit, and many of you in here wouldn't recognize that because it's rarely presented to any lawyer. The Certificate of Merit is presented to a Texas lawyer who has made a great contribution to the legal profession and the State Bar of Texas, especially during the last bar year. The recipient is chosen by the President, and this year the Certificate of Merit is awarded to Ann Greenberg. Ann is a shareholder in Walsh, Gallegos, and Austin, who for the past 3 years has ably served as the elected director of District 9, Place 3 on the State Bar Board. She is a longtime volunteer for the legal profession, having served as chair of the Austin Bar Foundation, president of the Austin Bar Association, and a director of the Travis County Women's Lawyer Association, among other roles. This year, Ann provided exceptional service as a third-year director on the State Bar Board and as a member of key committees, including the Nominations and Elections Committee, the Executive Committee, and the Search Committee that helped the board elect a new executive director and general counsel. Her dedication and experience have been invaluable. Mr. Rehan?
Good afternoon. My name is Rehan Ali Mohammed, and as outgoing chair of the board for the State Bar, it is my honor to help recognize our 50-year lawyers. We are honored today to have so many of our 50-year lawyers with us. In your own way, each of you played a role in building and strengthening this profession we are proud to call our own. Congratulations on this milestone accomplishment. I would ask that each of you stand as I call your name. Please hold your applause until the end. Ben Lewis Adderholt. Thomas L. Osley. Benny W. Bach II. Donald R. Boehm. David P. Brown. Sam J. Brown. Vincent Bustamante. Judge Joe Carroll, William Brent Clarkson, John P. Cogan, Jr., John R. Cook, Michael L. Cook, James L. Daniel, Jr., Judge William Edwin Denman, Byron F. Egan, Joe S. Falco, Jr., Harold P. Kip Glasscock, Garney Griggs, James David Guess, Judge Buddy J. Hahn, David W. Hanna, John William Harris, Jr., Thomas Oso Harris, Lawrence F. Harrison, Rick Harrison, R. Clayton Hutchins, Billy Britt Jarvis, Ronnie Burt Johnson, Jack M. Kinnebrew, Vincent L. Marino, Larry Matthews, Sidney Lee McLean, Jr., James Oliver McRae, Richard A. Peebles, John Lewis Pierce II, Stanley E. Rayhoot, William R. Ricks, Eduardo Roberto Rodriguez, Judge William Fletcher Sanderson, Jr., John Anthony Sauer, Alan J. Segal, W. Boone Vastine II, S. Ray Walker, Arthur Irwin Whitmer, Donald Lee Wolf, Buck Wood, Eugene B. Wright, Marvin B. Zimmerman. Before we thank this year's 50-year lawyers for their service, did I miss anyone? Please join me in congratulating these distinguished members of our profession. Thank you.
Thank you, Rayhan. Normally, I would have been at a dinner last night and would have thanked the people who have been nearest and dearest to me, and I didn't have that opportunity. So before I go on with my remarks today, I want to let you know that in the past year, whenever we felt or experienced difficulties, I've always said to Trey, it's all about relationships. And it really is. When I was first elected, I first met Frank Stevenson, and he was just another guy on the bar board. And now, Frank and Helen are among my dearest friends. It has been a tremendous honor to serve as the 137th president of the State Bar. Together, we faced a number of challenges in the past year, and together we have met each one with professionalism, civility, and honor. Our mission statement is broad, and our bar has programs that are nationally recognized to meet those goals. Law-related education efforts served more than 250,000 young children in Texas. That program is increasingly important when you realize that many of our residents can't name the three branches of government and certainly do not appreciate the rule of law and the role of our judiciary. Our Texas Lawyers Assistance Program is the envy of every state. Our CLE and Texas Bar Books are of the highest quality. And credit for all of that goes to you, the Texas lawyers who volunteer your time and expertise to make our bar the exemplary institution it is. It starts in the sections where like-minded attorneys are working to make substantive law better and to deliver their services more effectively. Additionally, I've appointed several hundred volunteers to work on committees like pattern jury charge committees, diversity, and advertising. This is the engine that drives our bar. Our board of directors is made up of a handful of public members who give greatly to our profession, a group of liaisons, but overwhelmingly it is the women and men who are the elected directors from around the state. These people give up significant hours of their time away from their practices, time away from their families, to attend board meetings, and committee meetings. This year was particularly time intrusive because we had executive director and general counsel searches. We rewrote the nominations and elections rules to make that process more equitable, and we rewrote a significant portion of the policy manual to make it current and consistent with the State Bar Act and the Supreme Court rules. I have been a first-hand witness to the dedication and sacrifice of the lawyers who make it possible for our bar to work well. I am forever grateful for your service. But the bar can be better. There is more we can do, and we can be more effective in that work when we work in unity. I have seen you speak up and stand together for the rule of law. I witnessed you coming to the aid of countless Texans after the natural disasters we suffered this year. I was there when you put civility first, when you stood on the courthouse steps and renewed your commitment to the Declaration of Independence, and when you celebrated Law Day in a manner that all Texans support. We can improve our bar if we do this work collaboratively and support each other. It has been a great honor to serve you for the past year. I have never been prouder to be a lawyer. Now it's my pleasure to introduce your next State Bar President. Joe K. Longley was born in West Plains, Missouri, where his mother was living while his father served as a B-17 pilot during World War II. By the time the war was over, Joe and his family had moved to Fort Worth, where he spent the next 12 years growing up in the public school system. After graduating from Arlington Heights High School, he moved to Austin to attend the University of Texas, where he majored in marketing. While at UT, he began working at the Capitol in Lieutenant Governor Preston Smith's office. The following year, he got a position in John Connolly's office, which he held while attending law school at UT. His interest in government continued after graduation, and he stayed in Austin working for the Office of the Attorney General for a year before moving to Corpus Christi to go into private practice. Joe soon found his way back to Austin, working as a solo practitioner and later founding the partnership of Longley and Maxwell with Philip K. Maxwell, and they practiced together for 25 years. He became a fixture at the Capitol, where he was instrumental in drafting numerous pieces of legislation, including the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act, the Consumer Protection Act, and amendments to the Texas Insurance Code. He went out on his own in 2005 and has been practicing solo ever since. Joe has authored numerous seminar papers, taught insurance law at the University of Texas, and served on the State Bar Board Directors, the District 9 Grievance Committee, and is chair of the Consumer and Commercial Law Section. In 2011, he received the State Bar Insurance Law Section's Insurance Legend Award. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium Joe Longley and Justice Eva Guzman of the Supreme Court, who will administer the oath of office.
It's my honor to administer the oath of office to our 138th president. If you'll raise your right hand. I, Joe Longley,
I, Joe Longley,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the duties of the office of President of the State Bar of Texas
the duties of the office of President of the State Bar of Texas
and will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution and laws of the United States
the Constitution and laws of the United States
and of this state.
and of this state.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Justice Guzman, and it's a real privilege to be standing here before you today. As Justice Guzman and Tom Vick have both said, I'm the 138th President of the State Bar of Texas. But you're experiencing a historic moment here today because I'm the first State Bar President ever to be elected from a petition campaign that's in the statute as well as the State Bar rules. In order to do that, thank you. In order to do that, any candidate has to gather in excess of 5% of our active membership, which many of you now know that is over 102,000 active members. So I had to achieve some 5,000 signatures in order to get on the ballot. I got on the ballot with 5,882 signatures, so we were able to surpass that, and I was very fortunate in being able to be victorious over two very fine candidates who also ran in that race. I want to send now a special thank you to Tom Vick. Together, it's been a pleasure working with Tom. Last year, during my year as President-elect, we reduced the State Bar budget by over $2 million, which is a 5% decrease. And I'm very thankful that we were able to do that without cutting programs and without adding to our normal reserves, which has now been increased to a 2.9 month reserve that we have in the event we need extra money. We also, in that last year, working together, accomplished transparency within the bar's internal functions and record structure. If you've been reading my reports in the Bar Journal, that is a significant advance with regard to the State Bar of Texas, which, as you all know, is a state agency. And these races for state bar directors, as well as president-elect, these are statewide offices, and the president-elect is a statewide elective office. So we become state officials when we take this oath. We have a new board that took the oath yesterday, 10 new members, and then with my oath today, we have a new president. We also passed, Tom and I working together with the board, new campaign activities, policy manual rules which provide for openness in elections and obviously much more free speech than what we had in the past. I think you've noticed in the campaign that just finished, in which Randy Sorrells will be our new president-elect and was sworn in yesterday, as well as in the campaign that I ran the year before. There's been much openness and much discussion, and these have been spirited campaigns, much like a political office for which the State Bar President-elect is a political office. The year ahead looks to be equally productive, and I look forward to working with Randy and hopefully, again, to reduce the budget by at least another 5%, which would be another $2 million out of our budget without necessarily cutting services. But even as we talk about a new day and new transparency and openness, I can't help but look back and reflect on my journey here as your new president and how that incorporates some of the old and some of the future. On the screen, you see where I started off. I worked for the Lieutenant Governor office in 1963 in the legislature, and then I was fortunate enough to be hired by John Connally, governor of Texas, and started there in January of 1964. It was there that I became very interested in the law, in legislation, how law works. And the one thing I noticed was that the stare decisis method of judicial change is much slower than legislative change. When you have legislative change, there's usually a section in the bar or act that's been passed that says this act becomes effective usually on September 1 of the year that it's passed. In the case of the DTPA, which you heard President Vick just talk about, that law passed with over 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate, which made it an effective immediately bill once it was signed. Governor Dolph Briscoe signed that bill on May the 21st, 1973, and it became effective on that date. My journey that I mentioned really took place in the 60s. Great advances were made in science. In the beginning of that decade, man circled the globe for the first time in a satellite, Friendship 7 with John Glenn, and it wound up in June of 1969 with man walking on the moon. In between those two dates, 62 through 69, a great deal happened. There was the Vietnam War. There was tumultuous protests throughout our land. We had several elections. We encountered 3 assassinations, political assassinations, of which John Connally was also struck down by a sniper's bullet in Dallas on that day in 1963. But he did survive, thankfully. I had the privilege of working for him through that time, and it was there that he encouraged me to apply to become a lawyer. And of course, to do that, you have to go to law school. I'll drop a footnote here and tell you about the day that I was accepted to the University of Texas School of Law. It was August the 1st, 1966. My wife, Susan Longley at the time, she's here with us today, called me and told me that she'd received a letter at the house and that I had been conditionally accepted to become a student at the University of Texas. And I said, well, what is the condition? Well, the condition was that I needed to go to the Dean of Student Life office in the main building at the University of Texas, which you see on the screen, we all know as the tower, and clean up these parking tickets that I'd incurred throughout my undergraduate career. Well, of course, with Susan, I raced over there. It was slightly before noon, August the 1st, 1966. We cleaned up the parking tickets, and as we walked out of the basement east wing of the University of Texas Tower, the shooting started. Susan was shot at that day. Thankfully, she was missed. She's with us here today. But that was the very first of what we now see as unnatural disasters. The senseless killings in our schools, in our campuses, in our homes, on our highways, in our churches. And that was what I call an unnatural disaster, because this kind of mindless killing has to stop. And we as lawyers, we obviously are the people who can come up with constitutional solutions, I hope, that will stop that. Because that was 52 years ago, and now almost monthly, bi-monthly, we see the same carnage happening over and over again. One of my initiatives is to put our minds together, put our hearts together, and see if there's some way we can remedy what I was a personal witness to that day in August of 1966. Governor Connally sent me to the emergency ER at Brackenridge Hospital, and my job was to get him back the names of the killed and wounded so that he could by telegram notify the next of kin, which he did that day. It's a scene that I'll never forget. But some ways that's been in the past, and I went on to law school. I graduated from law school in 1969. I was sworn in as a member of the State Bar of Texas in 1969, and it was at that time that I went to work at the Attorney General's office. The reason I went to the Attorney General's office as a 29-year-old chief of the Antitrust and Consumer Protection Division was simply because of politics. I'd had the good fortune of helping a candidate from Houston, a lawyer many of you know, John Hill, who ran. He was an unlikely candidate to win in that race in 1972, but that was the year of the Sharpstown scandal that happened right here in Houston. And top to bottom, all of the incumbents were turned out, and new people came in, and John Hill came in as the new Attorney General. He had confidence enough in me to appoint me as the 29-year-old chief of the Antitrust and Consumer Protection Division, and that's where I had the opportunity to draft the first draft of the Texas Consumer Protection Deceptive Trade Practices Act. The picture you see on the screen is the signing of that particular act. It went into effect on the date it was signed, March the 21st, 1973. That's John Hill, Governor Dolph Briscoe, and a young Joe Longley with slightly more hair that was a little darker in those days. We went on in that same session to pass many other consumer protection measures, but more importantly, there were many public enforcement acts that were passed that same session in '73. The Open Records Act, the Open Meetings Act, the Lobby Registration Act, the Campaign Finance Act. All of those were passed in that same session. And they were all passed in pretty strong form because everybody knew that session that things would probably return to normal and things would slow down after that, and they were right. So having passed and participated in many of those laws being passed that session, I was put on a speaking tour for the State Bar of Texas. And on that tour, we had many town hall meetings in which I participated with what I guess you would call just stalwarts of the State Bar at that time. There's a young lawyer, obviously with a dandruff problem, but giving a speech at a town hall in which I have two stalwarts of the State Bar of the old school. The one on the right is Leroy Jeffers, who was president in 1974 when this picture was taken. And he was president of the State Bar as well as a leading lawyer in Houston. The other gentleman is Percy Foreman, who I became very good friends with before he passed away. And you can see me pontificating on the wonders of consumer protection, I'm sure. And whatever it was I was selling that day, neither one of them appeared to be buying. But that's okay. That's sort of been the story of my life in many instances. But I became very good friends with many members of the bar, and it encouraged me to become a candidate to become a bar director, which I did in 1976. I'd run for State Bar Director in 1975 and was defeated by the president of the Austin Bar Association at that time. I ran again in 1976 against the new president of the State Bar of the Austin Bar Association, and that was a three-way race, and it wound up that I won that race in a runoff. And that put me on the bar board at a time when the new building was being built at 1414 Colorado Street. And that was the building that at the time, in order to be built, it had been mortgaged. I ran on the platform that state property should not have been mortgaged. A dues increase was attempted to be passed at that time to pay off the building, which I opposed. The dues increase failed by over a 2-to-1 margin in that race, and that's been the only proposed dues increase by the State Bar that's ever failed in the history, the 79 history of the State Bar. But then the board of directors at that time had confidence enough in me to make me the leader of trying to get the building paid for. And what I proposed was a one-time dues assessment, or an assessment of $150 per lawyer, which at that time we had right at 28,000 lawyers instead of the 102,000 we have now. It passed by a 4-to-1 margin, and the bar building got paid off, and we still use it today. So that is something that I'm very proud of in the past. Now, talking about the past, let's switch to the future. Last year, Justice Johnson, a good friend and a mentor through this first year, swore me in as the president-elect of the State Bar. During that last year, We were able to accomplish much, and I certainly appreciate the friendship that's been extended to me by all bar officers and directors, as well as all the members of the Supreme Court and the Court of Criminal Appeals. Looking at the future, we have a great future ahead of us. Access to justice, of course, is something we hear a lot about, and the people you see on your screen right now have done so much to help facilitate access to justice. But obviously, we need to do more. We got to remain vigilant, because all those laws that were passed in 1973, they all provided for access to justice, not only with causes of action that had never been recognized before, but also each one of those laws, the consumer laws and insurance code I'm talking about, provided for the award of attorney's fees to the plaintiffs who brought those cases, court costs and attorney's fees, reasonable in relation to the amount of work expended. So there was incentive for people to bring their quests to have and achieve justice where they'd been wronged by some financial practice. And those laws remain on the books today, but we have to be ever vigilant, because there have been methods that are used that has taken those cases out of the courthouse. One example is click here to agree. How many times have we in this room done that? When you click on your screen with your mouse to agree to something, generally speaking, you're taking whatever case you might have of a deceptive trade practice nature or consumer protection nature, that will no longer be accessed in the courthouse. It will be sent to mandatory arbitration because of the one click you made with that mouse. So instead of having open courts and open discussion and open decisions with regard to these laws, they're now done more in the darkness of a mandatory arbitration that is not open to the public. So we need to work in that general area as well to achieve access to justice to these laws that have been passed and the rule of law that has been used in the decisions for the last 40 years with regard to these statutes that were passed in those days. Today, then, it's about the past and the future, and we find ourselves at a critical juncture with the State Bar of Texas when the only constant seems to be change. Change is hard to come by sometimes, as we all know, and we do not always agree on the best way to go forward. But what unifies us as Texas lawyers is our shared commitment to the rule of law and access to justice. It's stronger now, and the differences, that commitment is stronger than the differences that we may have between us. With regard to my coming president year, Maggie and I want to reach out to everyone, the hand of friendship, and to have everyone participate in the reconciliation of our unity to the rule of law and to the access to justice as much as we can. I hope you'll join us in that effort. That's our common goal. Now I want to leave you with another image, and this is an image of another unnatural disaster, in my view. We have got to figure a way as lawyers and members of this noble profession to give homage to the words on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And closes with, I lift my lamp beside the golden shore. This picture depicts injustice, in my view. This little girl, not knowing those words, but her mother bringing her across in a rowboat less than 3 weeks ago from the south shore of the Rio Grande to the north shore of the Rio Grande, did not necessarily experience the welcome that the Statue of Liberty supposedly guarantees on the pedestal. We're also given other words, that there are unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the words of Thomas Jefferson. And it comes in a phrase that comes after the words, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary to do something. And I think we are very, very close to a human event which requires us to do something that is necessary. And that is, we must put the brilliant minds in this room together to figure a way to reunite these children with their parents. They may not be citizens, but they're entitled to due process, and they're entitled to have all of the protections while they're on our shore and with our ground, to have the protections of due process. And surely we can figure a way to find these children, number one, and reunite them with their parents. And then the law will take its course as usual. But they should not be used as pawns in some policy that not everyone agrees with. So I close with this. In Spanish, there is a phrase which is ya basta. It means generally enough, or enough is enough. And so, as I look to all of the members of the bar that are here today and who've honored me with your presence, I close with these words, ya basta.
Joe, we certainly wish you well for the coming year. You've given us much to think about of the challenges that lay ahead for all of us in the profession. Tom, thank you for your outstanding year as president, and we've got a lot we've done and a lot more to do. As you've noticed, our state bar at the annual meeting in recent years has developed a focus on remembering the most important parts of our history, and today we're going to follow in that pattern. This year, is the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. And as we were planning this year's program, I called my friend Doug Brinkley to see if he was available, and he was the one who actually pointed out to me the importance of that year. Yesterday, we got to hear Joe Crispino about how racial relations were before we had a Civil Rights Act in 1964. Now we're talking today about 1968 and how that law came into being and was lived out by two of its greatest leaders. Doug Brinkley is a professor of history at Rice University. He is the presidential historian for CNN. He is a best-selling author, and his next book, which will be coming out in April, is on John F. Kennedy and the race to the moon. So be prepared to see that and purchase that when it comes out. I'm sure it'll be another fantastic best-selling piece of history. So please welcome Doug Brinkley.
Thank you. Thank you, Talmadge, and I'll periodically look over to the wings there. I know you have the big screens, but we'll try to make sure we make some contact with people in the fringes there. It's an amazing facility. Thank you for having me. Talmadge is one of the grand impresarios of Texas art and literature, and let's hear it for Talmadge for organizing this all the time. It's remarkable what he does. And to Joe Longley, I was in an extraordinary talk he gave, and he was to the very thought of reminding us about John Conley being there in Dallas. Do you guys realize the day before Conley was shot and Kennedy killed in Dallas, John F. Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy were in Houston, right downtown here at the Rice Hotel the evening before. They were here for a bunch of, particularly with a Latino group they spoke in front of, and then the Kennedys flew up to Fort Worth and spent that night after being here in Houston. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Talmadge, and we'll take a look at 1968, what it means.
All right, well, Doug, at the time of their deaths 50 years ago, Dr. King and Robert Kennedy were viewed as the two most esteemed civil rights leaders in the country. During the 1960s, which was the most important decade in civil rights advancement since the emancipation in the 1860s. Now, many in this audience of over 50 years old have vivid memories of both those men, but there's many in this audience who are younger than 50 and have virtually no memories. So as a historian, what do you regard as the most important single trait that each of those two men brought to the civil rights movement?
Martin Luther King Jr. was a triple threat. He was an incredible writer, an amazing orator, and a very good grassroots political organizer. So you combine those three, and he's a very unique individual. We all think of Martin Luther King because we have Dr. King Day and the I Have a Dream speech, and his voice was so robust that we tend to almost picture him as a giant. If you go to the mall in Washington, D.C., and you see his memorial, it's a giant-sized Dr. King, but in truth, he was 5'8". He wasn't very large, but we think of him as so large because he carried himself with such utter conviction. The key to Dr. King, in my mind, is his Christianity. His father, Daddy King, of course, in Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. They grew up in Baptist tradition, and Martin Luther King wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and be a preacher, a minister. I think it's important that Dr. King got education in one of the historic black colleges, Negro colleges in America. It immersed him in the African American story, the Middle Passage, slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow. But a big moment came when he moved to Boston, not just for connecting with Coretta Scott King, but he earned his doctorate at Boston University. And if you want to study a historian, Dr. King's life, you go to his papers at BU up there. And there he got very involved with Reinhold Niebuhr and the theology. Niebuhr used to say the sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world. And it could be the same with law. The sad duty of being a lawyer is to establish justice in a sinful world. And King also expanded on thinking about Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence movement in India, Henry David Thoreau's great moment of dissidence during the Mexican-American War when Thoreau spent a night in jail. So King's becoming an intellectual. He comes back and moves to Montgomery, Alabama, and is given a church to run. And he was very young. He was just finishing his doctorate, a 28-year-old minister. And you guys just showed some of my books. One of them is a biography of Rosa Parks. And I once asked Mrs. Parks a kind of silly question. I said, do you remember when you first met Dr. King in Montgomery? And she goes, oh, yes, of course. And I said, well, could you tell he was destined for genius and that there was something unique about him? She said, well, he was speaking at the Pilgrim Insurance Company, and only 5 or so women went to hear him speak at night. Almost no audience. He's an unknown guy who just moved to Montgomery. And I said, well, could you tell from his talk that evening? She goes, oh, we don't even remember what he said, but boy, was he cute and good looking. And she said, we just kept saying we have the cutest preacher that you could possibly have in town now. And of course, their lives get tied together with the Montgomery bus boycott when December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks has that moment of civil disobedience, and Dr. King becomes the voice of the movement. But to finish that question on King, Talmadge, it was that education that he got mixed with a true Christian spirit and determination to help African American people in the freedom struggle. Rosa Parks was not Southern Baptist. She was African Methodist Episcopalian Church. The AME Church is a freedom church too. People like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were part of that. Bobby Kennedy, my wife Ann is here with me, and we just brought our kids to John F. Kennedy's birthplace in Brookline, Massachusetts, and Bobby Kennedy's born there too. And the takeaway, if you go to the birthplace of JFK and Bobby, it's just what a simple house it was in Boston, right near BU. Because you think of the Kennedys as fabulously wealthy, but this was a period when Joe Kennedy was making his fortune when they started having their brood of children, and this is pre-Cape Cod. And so young Bobby grew up in a sense of a hyper-competitive family, as you all know, and he became the one wanting to be most like his father. The Joe Jr., the one that the family had put high hopes on and maybe running for president someday, was killed in a very risky accident in World War II where Joe Jr. would go in an airplane. It would be 4 missiles. The Germans had V-2 bombs they were starting to be able to hit London with. And this is, intercontinental ballistic missile, essentially. But what we did is pack airplanes with Torpex like dynamite, even more powerful. We'd fill it, and Joe Kennedy was taking the plane over to France where they had a V-1 base, the Nazis, and then you'd aim the plane almost like a kamikaze mission to a facility and you'd parachute out. It doesn't get any riskier than that. He died, and then JFK, his brother, tries to become the leader of the family, and Bobby's always the number 2. But what's important for you guys is Bobby Kennedy was a lawyer. John F. Kennedy was not. John F. Kennedy wanted to be do what I do. He wanted to write history. He wanted to be a teacher, maybe a professor. He worked for the Hearst newspaper syndicate, do a little journalism, where Bobby was into law. And of course graduated from University of Virginia Law School and passed the Massachusetts bar in 1951 and becomes the Attorney General, and of course our Justice Department is named after him.
Mm-hmm. Now, we think of these two men together, and obviously they were operating the same era, they died in the same year, they walked parallel groundbreaking paths in the same era. But they were compatriots on issues, not colleagues, allies, but not friends. Somebody has said they walked up the same mountain, but from different sides. So the question is, given all that they had in common, why were the two men not close?
Great question, Talmadge. Keep in mind, if you would, in the 1950s, African Americans still voted with Republicans. It was the grand old party. Now, they didn't have an overwhelming majority, but Eisenhower in 56 got something like 40% of the African American vote in 56. In 1960, the African American vote goes overwhelmingly for John F. Kennedy over Nixon. Why? Why the shift? Because, Ike was pro-integration. Ike stepped up in Little Rock. Martin Luther King's father, Daddy King, was for Ike. What happened? And Nelson Rockefeller, the Rockefeller family, was funding all the African American traditional black colleges. So Republicans had a beat on this. Martin Luther King gets arrested in 1960. And Bobby Kennedy helps convince his brother, call him from jail. Not to make a big media moment of it, just to have candidate Senator John F. Kennedy call Dr. King in jail when he was arrested. That spread around the African American community like heat lightning. And then Bobby decided, and he was campaign manager, Bobby Kennedy of JFK in 60, we'll get a little pamphlet and send it all over the African American churches about the saying, where was Nixon ignored King, but JFK gave him a call. And so when you cut to how close that vote was in 1960, there's an argument to be made. John F. Kennedy wouldn't have been president if he had not made that phone call to Martin Luther King. But at that point, the Kennedys do a bit of a dance with King because J. Edgar Hoover's FBI is insisting that King is a communist, that he's a pervert. As you all famously know, the FBI starts bugging King and trying to destroy him. They have a tape of an extramarital affair Martin Luther King's having with a woman talking and groaning, and they bugged a motel room, and they send that to Coretta Scott King. Death threats on King. So Kennedy's always kind of careful, both Kennedys, how to deal with King. But the big uniting of the names Kennedy and King comes with the March on Washington because John F. Kennedy did not want Dr. King marching hundreds of thousands of people on the mall. But once King said, we're doing it, Kennedy invited them to the White House, met with King, and it went so smoothly, the March on Washington, with virtually no arrest, no problem, no rabble-rousing, that Kennedy started realizing, JFK and Bobby, that King was one of the big figures of the era. Martin Luther King will win a Nobel Peace Prize. And Bobby Kennedy and King, as you said, they're like two trains going on a parallel track promoting civil rights, but they're not close. Kennedy, RFK, Bobby, after his brother dies, does get into civil rights and gets close with somebody, but it was Cesar Chavez, the famous United Farm Workers Union leader that Bobby loved. And Ann and I just visited with Ethel Kennedy in March down in Palm Beach, and she'll talk for an hour to you about Cesar Chavez. They had a shared Catholicism. Ethel Kennedy goes to church right now about 4 times a week to Catholic masses. She's never missed a Sunday mass since her husband died. And Cesar Chavez would break his fast taking communion. And in '68, right before Bobby Kennedy was murdered running for president, there's that famous photo of him sitting and breaking one of the fasts of Cesar Chavez. So as a friendship, it was Cesar Chavez, but Chavez was being called the Martin Luther King of the Chicano Power movement in 1968.
Mm-hmm. Now, from January 1961 through December 1964, Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General of the United States. He continued on after his brother's assassination for over a year. So during those 4 years, he was the federal government's gatekeeper for the civil rights movement. So give him a grade. How do you grade him as the gatekeeper of the movement?
Of civil rights?
Yes.
On civil rights, I'd give him an A- or a B+. As a loyalist to his brother, an AAA+. Bobby took care of JFK in incredible ways, and we're looking at President Trump right now, doesn't have that alter ego figure to bounce things off of in this. Man, where JFK and Bobby became close, and he used to say, Bobby has the gonads. JFK was the more diplomatic. Bobby was a fighter. Go after people. And so they had a kind of unique dog and pony routine. And Bobby comes to become into his own, as you might remember, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we're about to go to war. It's the most tense moment in Cuba. And Bobby comes up basically with the strategy of negotiating with the Soviet ambassador on, look, you back your ships off, we have an embargo, your ships go home, but eventually, a year later, we won't tell people, but we will remove our ICBMs, our Jupiter missiles, from Turkey. And Bobby makes a very intricate deal that works. An argument can be made JFK wins the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev's was really coasting up into Cuba because of Sputnik, and they put Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut, and Russia maybe outfoxed Kennedy in some diplomacy, but after Cuban Missile Crisis, it's the beginning of the end of Khrushchev. And Bobby and civil rights was tough of Southern bigots in his mind, and he liked to get on the phone and tell a governor of Alabama and Arkansas to go shove it, or we'll put the full power of the law down your throat. He would talk in visceral terms, something that Jack Kennedy would never do to a fellow politician.
Well, in terms of that harsh side to his personality, Martin Luther King was obviously aware that Bobby had worked for Joseph McCarthy, which was frightening to think about. And so in the early 1960s, King told his friend Harry Belafonte to go and find Robert Kennedy's moral center. And in time, King, Belafonte, and others found it. And then once they found it, they helped shape it toward his becoming such a great champion in civil rights. So explain that transformation of Bobby Kennedy during the 1960s when he changed from a mode of detachment on civil rights to commitment.
Talmadge touched on a very key point. We tend to forget Bobby Kennedy, one of his heroes, was Joe McCarthy of McCarthyism. Because we hear the name Kennedy, we think liberal because of Ted Kennedy and the liberalism of the late 60s and 70s. But just imagine RFK is in sync with Joe McCarthy. In fact, even when McCarthy gets destroyed and near McCarthy's death from alcoholism, Bobby visits him, is a loyalist to Joe McCarthy. Never mistake that Bobby and Jack were staunch anti-communist. What they didn't trust, what Bobby didn't believe in J. Edgar Hoover's notion that Dr. King was a communist because of a man named Mr. Levinson, who had been once member of the Communist Party and all this. They just thought that Hoover had a vendetta against King and was out to get him. But I'd like to say there's the one thing that makes Bobby Kennedy biographies really fun to read or interesting, the good ones. One by Larry Tye, T-Y-E, if you want to read one's really good. But he gradually grows. His heart grows. And to the point, by the time his brother is killed, it was so devastating to him, he starts trying to heal. And Bobby would do things to overcome his fears. He was afraid of heights, so he'd go climb a tall mountain. He's afraid of rushing water, so he'd throw himself into a stream. And at the same time, he started circulating more. And by 64, 65, 66, when he's a senator of New York State, we forget Bobby Kennedy became senator after attorney general sometimes. He started interacting with people in Harlem, going into Appalachian Hollows, dirt roads in the Mississippi Delta, the Latino field workers in the San Joaquin Valley in California, Native American Sioux Indians in the Dakotas. And he went open-hearted, and he started seeing his role in life as to be a champion of the underdog, of the underrepresented, of the down and out. And a book that came out in 1962 by Michael Harrington called The Other America, about poverty in America, had a deep influence on RFK. But also, he turned on the Vietnam War. He wrote a book called To Make a Newer World. It was a mild dissent on Vietnam, but he identified with the anti-war movement, which made him an enemy of Lyndon Johnson. And the best book on Lyndon and RFK is, the title will tell you all, Mutual Contempt is the name of the book. LBJ and RFK despised each other. I write sometimes on environmental history, and in Stuart Udall, Interior Secretary, in 1969, right before Lyndon was about to leave office, January 69, Nixon's coming in. Udall had an entire list of national monuments, that rare, scenic, beautiful places that they were going to save with an executive order. And he made the mistake of including on it that they would have an RFK Memorial Football Stadium in D.C. And when Johnson saw that they were going to name a stadium after RFK using Interior Department, he went ballistic and told Udall, you get none of your monuments because you're trying to shove RFK last minute down my throat. Johnson thought that Bobby had all of these acolytes. I went to the funeral last week of Doris Kearns Goodwin's husband, Dick Goodwin, who was a speechwriter. Dick wrote the We Shall Overcome speech for Lyndon Johnson, but he was a Kennedyite. And, LBJ couldn't get rid of the Kennedys. And he didn't hate Jack, he didn't like him, but Bobby Kennedy would call him names, make fun of him, and it's just a brutal relationship. It's pretty hard to find a political hatred deeper than, Hillary Clinton and Trump may be that right now, but they're in opposite parties. To have two people in the same party loathe each other to this degree is a standout in U.S. political history.
When we talk, going back to Dr. King now, to kind of give him a little equal time, famously the Birmingham protest, which he said bifurcated John F. Kennedy's presidency, because it wasn't until then that Kennedy realized it was a moral issue for integration to take place and civil rights and so forth. And of course, he was put in jail. He wrote the letter from Birmingham jail. Our speaker yesterday, Joe Crispino, said he regards the letter from Birmingham jail on the same order as Thomas Paine's Common Sense and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address as essential documents in American democracy. Do you put it on that level?
I do. I agree with them. I didn't hear him say it, but I agree with them. Joe Longley, a little bit ago, put a photograph from the border of the young child, being separated from their parents. And I've been being called this week that's an Associated Press photo, that's like a game-changing photograph because it involves children being separated from their families. Birmingham, when the police in Birmingham and Bull Connor started arresting children. Now, the civil rights leaders perfectly dressed would march, but kids got arrested and they went to jail. That really angered to no end Bobby Kennedy. Now, you're putting kids in jail, just like people are outraged right now. And the reason they did it in Hoover, they thought they were destroying Dr. King when he went to jail in Birmingham, because they knew from tapping wire, surveillance, that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King's nonprofit, had no money. They didn't have the bail money to get those kids out. So King's opposition thought, kids in jail, it's going to look bad on Dr. King. They got no money to bail him out. They're going to stay there for a while. People are going to say, why would they march kids? They get arrested and they don't even get them out of jail. They're leaving them there. So it's this big moment when King's in jail, and they do two really important things Dr. King does. One is write the letter from the Birmingham City Jail. He had a New York Times given to him, and he handwrote essentially a sermon, but a beautiful letter asking white preachers, ministers, why aren't you in jail with me? In other words, a Thoreauvian moment, or at least, why aren't you speaking out if you're a person of Jesus Christ? Because what they're doing to children here in Birmingham, powerful. But what about the money? Harry Belafonte got a lawyer named Clarence Jones, who was an African-American lawyer, some for Dr. King. He flew up over the weekend to New York City to meet with David Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, Chase Bank and the fortune, went into the bank on a weekend and got them a boatload of money, cash, to give Clarence Jones, the lawyer, to bail all those kids out. Rockefeller deserves a lot of credit for doing that. And at that moment, the kids are released. King's letter from Birmingham jail is being talked about as one of the great moral documents. And Birmingham becomes Bombingham. And the negative press coverage, CBS with Cronkite and others, are just showing how horrible Alabama, and particularly Birmingham police are. And King gets a win out of Birmingham. It puts wind in his sail.
Mm-hmm. Now, after he was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1963, after the March on Washington in Birmingham, then he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. He led the March for Voting Rights from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1965. He was at his highest point, and then he tried to move his campaign from the South to the North, really without much success. So what was the disconnect between Martin Luther King, who had such a hold on the South, and why was he unable to spread it through the rest of the country?
I think he had a network lined up of the churches, the black churches in the South, and so you really had quite a network that he had, and he didn't have that when he tried to go to Chicago or Milwaukee or Cleveland. It didn't translate. But the bigger problem for King is he starts here Lyndon Johnson does the big Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. And King, shortly thereafter, will go to 1967, goes to the Riverside Church in New York and denounces the Vietnam War as being immoral, meaning Lyndon Johnson's war. And at that point, Johnson no longer defends King. Basically, he tells Hoover, do what you want with King. I've had it. Here I put all my political skin on civil rights, and King's betrays me by publicly turning on my war and picking on me when I'm in a bind right now. And so Johnson did this, and there's some evidence of the FBI's hounding of Hoover, Hoover hounding of King as last year. One of the things that always stood out to me as odd in the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper when King came right before his death, they announced he's staying at the Holiday Inn and put his room number in the paper. Well, if you're a kook that wants to get Martin Luther King, you're telling everybody the room number where he's sleeping. And this was the pre-days of these plastic cards that you might have to put in an elevator for security. Anybody could have just walked up a stairwell and had at him. So King moved to the Lorraine motel there. And James Earl Ray famously, does that shot over there. If any of you, I'm sure about 30 you probably have, but if you haven't gone to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, go. They're at the Lorraine Motel. They've kept it as a time capsule of 68 and have done a fine interpretive job of it. And it's worth the time it would take to go to Memphis to see that site. And I'll give you a bit of good news. Birmingham, after all that ugliness, they've done a marvelous Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham. And you can go see, they've done a recreation of what the jail cell of Dr. King was like. Remember early in our talk today, I mentioned the name Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau wrote the famous essay on civil disobedience from not paying taxes for the Mexican-American War. And so he spends his night in jail and writes civil disobedience. King's taking that Thoreauvian lesson. He's in the jail in Birmingham and remembers how Thoreau did it and writes that letter from Birmingham City Jail. So the other thing, Talmadge, is Rosa Parks told me about Dr. King to keep in mind in this nonviolent movement. They were in Birmingham for an NAACP conference around 65, and I think it was 65, and Dr. King was speaking. But while King was on, Rosa was just sitting there in the audience. When King was talking, a white man came running out from the side and punched King in the face. And all these security people started going to grab the guy, and King goes, no, leave him alone, leave him alone. Why did you hit me? And he does this kind of down talk, psychological thing right on stage after he was with this attacker. And the attacker says, he stumbled, and then he said, Sammy Davis Jr. married a white woman. The black entertainer had married a white woman, and the guy was crazy, and then he went and attacked King. So the police take him away, and Rosa Parks put an ice pack backstage, got him aspirin and a Coca-Cola, and she said incessantly, King kept saying, I don't want any charges pressed against that guy. Nobody should be mean to him. I don't want him handcuffed when they're charging him. So worried about how the man who just attacked him would be treated. And I said, well, what did she go? She goes, she said to me, and she was a very demure woman, that tells you how crazy Martin was about nonviolence. She said, I would have punched the guy back in the face. Somebody punches me like that, but he dropped his arms and he was acting out this philosophy of nonviolence in a very tangible and real way. He believed in it. At his core, his nonviolence, and he saw that any kind of violence as a tricky slope to the progress becoming unglued of civil rights.
So he had this unique commitment to nonviolence, and obviously he wanted those around him to follow him in that regard, but he was unsuccessful because there were many civil rights movement who thought violence was definitely a part of a successful strategy. So my question is, did violence accomplish anything good for the civil rights movement?
Well, no. Violence doesn't get anything good. We're reassessing figures. Obviously, there's a greatness to Malcolm X and about the individual and self-respect. And he's a sustainable hero, Malcolm X. And the Black Panthers of the late 60s are being reconsidered, which once seemed really crazy, like free lunch programs and after school education programs of some of the Oakland Panthers are now looking pretty good in history. But the amount of violence that breaks out in the late 60s, the riots in Newark and Detroit and Los Angeles, on and on and on, just left communities shattered, buildings burned, people arrested. It just had lost some of its connection to the spiritual essence that King was promoting. So I don't think you ever want to say violence leads to good things, but it's a big issue in American history. When I have to teach at Rice here, the big one I have students deal with is John Brown and the Civil War, Brown wants to free the slaves, so he seizes the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Is Brown a hero, like Thoreau claims, because he had butchered people, John Brown, that owned slaves in Kansas, bloody Kansas, killed slave owners? But is Brown a hero for doing all this because slavery is such an evil, or is he a psychopath who murdered people? You know, is he a terrorist or not a terrorist, John Brown? It's a very big question, and that's what one of the things that divided our nation in the Civil War was over John Brown. Can you not be pacifist? When do you have to step up and defend yourself? And you know, it's a line there, but I think this strongest part of civil rights came with Dr. King's nonviolence movement and people like John Lewis, who's keeping the torch alive today, because Lewis gets involved with American politics. He's in Congress fighting for people today. Andy Young goes on to be a mayor of Atlanta and part of the process. A lot of the best people of the civil rights movement continue to fight for the greatness of our country, and it makes them kind of sustainable heroes. But people that did random violence end up not looking as well, to put it mildly.
Mm-hmm. Now, in December of 1966, nationally syndicated columnist Mary McGrory said that Martin Luther King had become obsolete because the civil rights laws that he was instrumental in getting passed meant nothing to millions of African Americans, particularly in the urban slums. So how did the nation's most dynamic spokesperson for civil rights lose his momentum?
A new youth movement came up. Dr. King's generation is part of a World War II generation. When you look at a lot of these figures of civil rights, they served in World War II. Medgar Evers was in the Marines. He gets gunned down in Jackson, but he was doing voting rights in Mississippi. So a Marine. Hosea Williams, who was if King was speaking here today, Hosea Williams would have come last night to kind of stir things up. He was King's advance man, and he used to say, I got the thrill of killing Nazis in Germany. Military man. James Meredith, who integrated Ole Miss, was in the Air Force. James Foreman, and all these, this is coming out of, hey, I fought abroad against fascism to come home to confront fascism in Texas or Louisiana or Mississippi. But by 67, those are the old parents' World War II generation, and the younger African-American sound were rejecting the gospel music of Mahalia Jackson or Odetta, and instead we're getting into the, James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, getting into the Black Power book of Charles Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael, breaking that King is too friendly with white people, in a sense, the Black Power movement never called Dr. King an Uncle Tom, but they felt that he's up pie in the sky. White people hate black people, and there'll never be equality. The dream's just a bunch of rhetoric. We got to seize political power with our own hands. Bob Dylan has a song called It's All Over Now, Baby Blue that came out in this period. He goes, it's all over now, baby blue. And in Dylan's verse, he says, the empty-handed beggar at your door is standing in the clothes that you once wore. It was meant to be about kind of the hippies. The empty-handed beggar at your door is standing in the clothes that you once wore. And the Black Panthers added, and he's got a machine gun in his hands, mother effers. So that militancy kind of kicks in, and King was seen as, to some degree, as yesterday's news. But in '68, he went into Memphis, famously with the sanitation workers' strike, when he was killed. And that spring of '68, he was supposed to be going on a new march on Washington, which was a poor people's campaign for everybody who was just Native Americans, Latinos, but also poor whites, labor unions. A big figure in all this period Talmadge and I are talking about is Walter Reuther also. He used to fund a lot of things with the labor unions backing Dr. King's action. Abernathy, after the death of Martin, can't pull it off. He doesn't have the charisma. He doesn't have the ability to micromanage a lot of people. Dr. King, could be sitting here with you wearing a suit and be the most polite, smart, kind, calm, genteel man you ever met. And that same night, Dr. King could go into the most dangerous bar in Houston and fit in with rabble-rousers, midnight riders, boozed-up people. He could operate on all realms of African-American community. Abernathy never could get out of being Abernathy. He didn't have the scope or the breadth of Dr. King. A great man, Ralph Abernathy, but he never could fill in the big shoes of Dr. King.
Last question is a hypothetical question. If Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were alive today, do you think they'd be more pleased or more displeased about the advancements we've made in civil rights over the last 50 years?
I think till about a year ago they would have been pleased. They had, the first African American president, Barack Obama. That was the dream. And incidentally, Bobby Kennedy prophetically said that we will have an African American president. And many people thought when Bobby said it, it was pandering to black folks. But he was envisioning that America was headed in that direction. The civil rights law keeps building on itself, but we're in a backlash period right now that I think would trouble both Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King. Bobby is a Democrat. Any way you want to cut it, he would have been on the Democratic side of all issues going on today. Dr. King would have been more sympathetic to things like Black Lives Matters, and I'm sure would have been very engaged on the U.S.-Mexican border issues now, because at heart he was trying to be a minister, trying to actualize the teachings of Christ. And I end, Talmadge, by telling you, don't minimize on both of those two men God. I mean, all of us have our own religion. When we did our Pledge of Allegiance, and we said a little prayer before we ate, but they came through their own journeys to it. Obviously, King was more of a theologian than RFK, but both of them felt they had a higher spiritual calling that came out of witnessing tragedy and they felt, so when Dr. King, when he gave the mountaintop speech in Memphis, someday I'm on the mountaintop and all that. He had God running through him. He wasn't really afraid of a white racist or bigot or a guy smacking him in the face, because he had made a kind of kindred connection to God because he spent so much of his life on spiritual maintenance. That they both, and Bobby did that via the Catholic Church.
Well, Doug, thanks so much. I hope you all have enjoyed the program, and Doug's excited.
Thank you, guys.
On behalf of the State Bar of Texas, thank you, Talmadge and Professor Brinkley. It's an honor to have you on the stage. I hope you all enjoyed the rest of the CLE. Thank you for attending the 2018 State Bar Annual Meeting. The general session is adjourned.